Since the Meiji reform, Japanese tried very hard to become just like Westerners. They wanted to be distinguished from other Asians like Koreans and Chinese. They achieved just that in very short period of time. They became an advanced country just like Western powers, and Japan was the only country that had a colony in Asia. On June 20, 1940, Japanese Empire announced the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan was asking other Asian countries to be unified under the leadership of Japan so that they are not ruled by the Western powers. It was simply a justification of Japanese colonization of other Asian countries. On October 8, 1941, Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of the Army, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the most powerful man in Japan, and he directed the Pacific War single-handedly. Almost at the same time as Pearl Harbor attack, Japan invaded 3 strategic areas in Southeast Asia. For petroleum, Japan attacked the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and they invaded Malaysia, British Malaya, for rubber plantation and tin mines. And Japan also invaded Burma to cut off supply lines to Chinese army. There was a Burma road connecting to Yunnan province in China, and at the time it was the only supply route by land to Chinese army. Japan conducted many massive surprise attacks on ports and airstrips and islands in Southeast Asia. Japanese troops were well trained and off-guarded American, British, Australian, Dutch forces, and their local allies were defeated easily. In the middle of 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese territorial expansion was immense. The territory extended from Manchuria in the north to New Guinea in the south, from the border of Indian Assam in the west to the Gilbert Island in the South Pacific. Unfortunately, Koreans were the victims of Japanese war efforts against powers in the continent. During the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895, Koreans provided Japanese with war materials, laborers, and land base. During Russo-Japanese War in 1904, Koreans did the same thing. There were no exceptions during the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. Since the First Sino-Japanese War, Japanese began to migrate to Korea. By 1910, when Japan annexed Korea, there were 170,000 Japanese living in Korea. They were mostly farmers. The Japanese government in Korea came up with a shrewd idea to give land to the newcomers from Japan. It instituted land reform that required deed, titles, and papers to prove their ownership. However, in Korea, there were no such thing. It was basically verbal ownership. Through the land reform, the Japanese gradually took over land ownership in Korea. By 1932, over 50% of Korean farming land was owned by Japanese. And the Korean farmers who lost their land to Japanese had to leave their hometown and work in the factories in the cities. In 1925, Japan organized Korean History Compilation Committee, and it manipulated Korean history to justify her occupation of Korea and prove their superiority to Koreans. The Japanese government in Korea demolished most of the palace of Joseon Dynasty Gyeongbokgung, and they held the World Expo in the place. It attracted many visitors from all over Korea. And it built Japanese administrative headquarters, and the building functioned as South Korean government until 1990s. Since the annexation of Korea, Japanese government made sure that the Koreans could be differentiated from Japanese. So even if Koreans wanted to change their name to Japanese one, they could not do it until 1939. As Japanese front and the territory expanded vastly, Japanese need more people, and they decided to include Koreans for their war efforts. And they had to upgrade Koreans to be like Japanese citizens. In 1939, Koreans had to give up their Korean name and get a new Japanese name. There was no choice for Koreans, and they had to obey the order of Japanese government in Korea. Some Koreans refused it, but many welcomed it. By then, Japanese were winning every single battle they fought, and the Koreans saw the Japanese occupation of vast territory in the world, and they began to be doubtful about their independence, and they began to believe in that Japanese occupation could be permanent. In 1938, a national mobilization law became effective. Japanese government could take anyone and anything that they needed for the war. There were severe labor shortage in Japan at the time because too many Japanese young men went to fight for the war. To fill the gap, many Koreans were recruited to work in factories and mines in Korea, Japan, and Manchuria. About 5,400,000 Koreans were conscripted, and 670,000 were sent to Japan and Sakhalin. Most of them worked in coal mines under appalling and dangerous conditions. There were no medical cares, and the food was so bad that it caused diarrhea, and the working hours were very long. Everybody was extremely emaciated because of starvation and fatigue, and their body had only skin and bones. And they often died under the rubble of dynamite explosion. About 60,000 Korean laborers died in Japan, and up to 810,000 died in Korea and Manchuria. 43,000 Koreans in Sakhalin could not return to Korea because the Soviet Union, who occupied South Sakhalin after World War II, did not send them back to Japan or Korea. The government rationed the grain, mostly rice, and the amount were getting smaller and smaller as the war progressed. And one day the government asked the people eat soup at least once a day. Koreans wore rubber shoes and the Japanese wore shoes made of woods. And one day the government asked all the people wore shoes made of woods instead of rubbers. The government took all the rubber shoes to make weapons. People had to give up anything made of metals. Bowls, containers made of metals, even church bells the government took to make weapons. As Japanese came to Korea, Koreans migrated to Japan for better opportunities. By 1939, 1 million Koreans lived in Japanese archipelago. During World War II, it grew to be 2 million. Some were immigrants and some were forced laborers. As gaining more territories, Japan needed more people, like soldiers, laborers, and government workers. So, Japanese government decided to make Koreans to be like Japanese. Japanese citizens were called imperial citizen, and the Koreans would be imperial citizen. In fact, many Koreans felt honored to become imperial citizens. In the early part of colonial era, Japanese government allowed schools in Korea to teach Hangul, the Korean language. But from 1938, Korean language teaching in schools in Korea began to be limited. By 1943, all the teachings in schools in Korea had to be done in Japanese, and the Koreans were banned in school. The students even could not speak in Korean in schools. Japanese government recruited many Koreans to make them soldiers, but majority of Koreans could not speak or write in Japanese, and they faced a great deal of difficulty in military training because of language barrier. Some Koreans who could speak Japanese became soldiers in Japanese Imperial Army, and the Japanese did not trust Korean soldiers in their army, so they were given non-combat duties such as prison guard in Southeast Asia. However, about 200,000 Koreans became soldiers in Imperial Japanese Army. Some elite Koreans became officers and even generals in Imperial Japanese Army. The notorious one was the Lieutenant General Hong Sa-ik, who commanded a prison camp in Philippines from 1944 to 1945, and he was executed as a war criminal after World War II. During Pacific War, Japan needed many more officers and government officials. Japan opened up a military academy and government administrative schools in Manchuria. By then, many Koreans believed that the Japanese occupation of Korea would be permanent, and they gave up Korean independence movement. And even the elites who were actively involved in Korean independent movement in the early part of colonial era became collaborators with Japan. Many Korean smart students went to schools in Manchuria and Japan, and they became officers in Imperial Japanese Army, and after World War II, they became generals in Korean Army. Park Chung-hee, who was the president of South Korea, and he was an officer in Japanese Imperial Army in Manchuria. And he was notorious for being a dictator, but famous for rescuing Korean people from poverty and laying foundation for economic miracle of South Korea. Jung Il-kwon, who graduated from Japanese Imperial Army Academy, later he became a chief of army staff in South Korean Army, and also he served as a prime minister for many years in South Korean government. Park Sun-yup, who was an officer in Japanese Kwangdong Army in Manchuria, became general in South Korean Army after World War II, and he was the most fierce fighter during Korean War against North Koreans. The first 10 of the Chief of Army Staff of South Korean Army were the graduates of Military Academy in Manchuria or the Japanese Imperial Army Academy in Japan. But no officers from Korean Liberation Army became Chief of Army Staff in South Korean Army, even though they fought against Japanese in China with Kuomintang Army. The graduates of Japanese Military Academy in Manchuria would become the core group of the conservatives in South Korean politics. However, many Koreans who have a strong anti-Japanese sentiment would not forgive their careers during Japanese occupation, and they will carry the tag of Japanese collaborators forever. On December 10, 1941, the Provisional Government of Korea declared a war against Japan, and Kim Gu created the Korean Liberation Army.